and thanks for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. We're delighted today to have as our guest Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College and author of Can We Talk About Race? And the other book is a groundbreaking book, Why Are All of the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, just re-released with a brilliant and timely update to take into account what exactly has happened in those cafeterias in the last 20 years. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I must say that I got a little bit frightened when I read your book, because the 20 years that have ensued since your book first hit the bestseller list, we were all reading it then and talking about it, the 20 years have not been kind in terms of race relations in this country.
No, it really hasn't been a good period. It's interesting because if you are as old as I am, someone
or
born,
older,
born in the 50s,
right.
You can look back to the days of Jim Crow in the 50s and say, of course we've come forward. But if you look at the last 20 years, there's been a lot of regression, whether that's the anti-affirmative action backlash or the collapse of the economy in 2008 and the impact on communities of color, or just the continuing segregation, in some places increasing segregation of schools. There's a lot that we have not been able to fix. I
know, and what you call it hyper-segregation, that's what we have now, where it's not even a 60-40, it's like a 90-10
exactly.
breakdown.
In many places, Black and Latino students are going to schools where there are less than 10% white students present.
So they are still sitting together in the cafeteria. Talk to us about what that's like in 2018. Why are they still sitting together?
Well, I think if you look at the places where young people of color and white students are going to school together, it tends to be high schools in suburban communities, or perhaps in colleges and universities. Those are often the most diverse learning environments for young people of color and white students to come together, is at the college level. And if you think about that, let's imagine they're in college together. Most of them have come from neighborhoods where they've had limited opportunity to engage with one another. They've been exposed to...
Because of the hypersegregation.
Exactly.
They haven't seen each other before.
Yes,
much.
Because of the hypersegregation, they haven't had much close interaction, and we all are getting misinformation about people different from ourselves. And so when kids come together in those places where they do, their interactions are often being influenced by stereotypes, by misinformation, by distorted information, leading to awkwardness, sometimes hostility, but sometimes not even hostility, sometimes just I'm uncomfortable with what's unfamiliar, and therefore I stick with what I know.
Right, right. Well, I was asking you a little bit about your own background. We always on this show say, place yourself in Black America. So where did you grow up, and what were the influences that brought you to the point where you could understand and translate for the rest of us what was going on racially in this country?
That's a great question. I am a child of the Great Migration. By that I mean I was born in Tallahassee, Florida in 1954, I don't mind saying that, which is the year of Brown versus Board of Education.
Of course.
My parents were both Howard University graduates, and my father went off to the University of Iowa and got a master's degree in art and was teaching art at Florida A&M.
Well, that was unusual.
Yeah, I mean, he was there like in the early 50s, and then in 1954 they were living in Tallahassee, my dad teaching at FAMU, and I was born, and he was interested in pursuing his career in higher education and needed a doctorate. And even though it was after Brown versus Board of Education, he was not able to go to Florida State, which had the program he wanted in art education, a doctorate in art education, same city, Tallahassee, but still segregated. So the state of Florida accommodated him by paying his transportation to Pennsylvania. He got his degree.
The state got him a plane ticket or a train ticket
out
of town.
Exactly, exactly.
A ticket out of town, right?
Which sounds crazy today, but that is what Southern states did to avoid having to desegregate their flagship institutions. So rather than being able to go to Florida State across town, he had to get on a train and go to Penn State. When he finished his degree in 1957, he got his doctorate. My parents did not want to raise their children in the segregated South. And so they moved to Massachusetts, where my father became the first African-American professor at Bridgewater State College, now known as Bridgewater State University. So that was 1958, and I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, as one of just a very few black kids in the community.
Right, right. Well, I was looking at a TEDx speech that you gave. I mean, these are very select. Not everybody gets to speak at TEDx.
Yes.
And you were at Stanford TEDx, all of that. I have 3 small grandchildren, and I am really taxed at some point or another every single day in trying to explain race relations to them. But you just have such a wonderful way about you and how you approach it. Let's take a look at you talking about your son and chocolate milk.
My first experience with a preschool conversation was with a 3-year-old, my own son, named Jonathan. When Jonathan was 3, we lived in Massachusetts, and he attended a daycare center where he was the only black child in his class. One day I picked him up and he said, "Mom, Eddie says my skin is brown because I drink chocolate milk. Is that true?" I said, "No, Jonathan, that's not true. Your skin is brown because you have something in your skin called melanin. Everybody has some. Even Eddie. Remember when he went to visit his grandmother in Florida and he came back with a tan? It was the melanin that made his skin turn brown in the sun. Everybody has some, but at your school, in your class, you are the kid with the most." Jonathan seemed to understand what I was saying, and he was very tickled by the idea that he had the most of something. But I wondered about Eddie, the kid with the chocolate milk theory. Had anybody set him straight?
Exactly. What about Eddie? Will you come to my house, please, when my grandchildren are there? Because now Jonathan is how old now? When
36
he's
almost.
36, and that was his experience.
Yes.
My grandson, Sam, had a similar experience. Was excluded because of the color of his skin only recently in preschool. I mean, so he's 4. And so having to explain to him in the home what that was about, and then having to take that to the school and have them have this discussion, as you do later in the TEDx. I recommend it. You know, this whole idea of color and what it means. Nobody's really black or really white. So we haven't really moved all that far.
No, and that's just it. One of the things that I talk at length about my book is how important conversations are, whether it's conversations with 3-year-olds or their teachers or among ourselves as adults, but particularly when we think about how children are growing up today. If we're not talking about race, if we're silent on the subject, it doesn't prevent them from learning about it. They just learn it in ways that we might not approve of. They get information on the street. They get information from television. They get information from lots of places that is often inaccurate, confusing, based on stereotypes.
Right, and one of the things that we have known and watched for years is the Clark experience. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who, with the 2 dolls, one black, one white, testing in a way black and white children's, I suppose, reaction to these 2 dolls. Let's take a look at this video of some of that testing, and we'll talk on the other side.
Sure.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
So heartbreaking. I don't care how many times I see that, know about it, whatever. You know, the fact that that last little girl could not even touch the black doll, such revulsion in a sense.
It's hard to watch that, and certainly the Clark test was done, you know, long ago in the 30s, but it has been repeated, often with similar results, and it just lets us know how early young children are exposed to messages about the value of whiteness in our society and the way blackness is devalued. You know, one of the things that we can know is that young children can feel very good about who they are themselves, loved by their parents, happy in their homes, and still assume negative things about being black and positive things about being white because it's so pervasive in the culture.
And what we have now as parents and grandparents and great-grandparents is now publishing is beginning to catch up. So they are, we can go buy books about our black history, et cetera. But I want to tell you, when I'm reading the story of slavery and my 4-year-old wants to know, what do you mean they owned that person? You know, so how do you start a decent, positive conversation about race with small children, because it's so essential that they get it then?
Yes. Well, you know, there are lots of different ways to talk about racial difference, and then there's racial history, right? Slavery is a hard conversation to have with a 4-year-old. As you made reference to my TEDx talk, I talk about how I had that conversation with my own son.
I'm just going to play that conversation. I was going to say, Sam, Sophie, Avery, come, watch Dr. Tatum. She's going to tell you all about it.
Well, and when that conversation occurred, it wasn't because I thought, oh, let's have a conversation about slavery today, but it had to do with a conversation where my 4-year-old son said, why are we living here? I was talking about Africa and what a great place Africa was, and connecting that to our history as African Americans in response to a question he asked me. And he said, if Africa is so great, what are we doing here?
That's a good question.
It was a great question. You know, he's a smart kid, and I didn't know how I could explain that without talking about slavery. But one of the things that I would say is that it's really important to, on the one hand, be honest about our history, but also to be clear in ways that sometimes we don't get in school about the way that people who were enslaved resisted. Resisted their victimization, tried to escape, tried to run away, fought against the people who were trying to enslave them. And also, it's important for our children to know that they had allies, that not all white people were slave traders, not all white people were in favor of slavery. There were people who were working to end slavery, the abolitionists, and even those people who were running away, the Underground Railroad, were being helped along the way, so that there's a sense of not only empowerment, yes, sometimes bad things happen, but we can work against those bad things.
Right.
And that, and also that these things that we're talking about right now, slavery, was a long time ago.
Yes, but for those of us who have these small children now, what's going on right now is so disturbing. The new word in our vocabulary in the household now is deportation.
Yes.
What does that mean? Why are they being sent away? And so the environment, let's talk a little bit again about those 20 years and what has happened.
Yes.
You mentioned Stephen Phillips' book, Brown is the New White.
Yes.
So in your book.
I do. I talk about that, and it's all about demographics. The fact that our demographics have changed dramatically over my lifetime, certainly, and in the last 20 years in particular. In the 50s, the U.S. population was 90% white, 90. And in 2014, the school-age population was more than 50% children of color. That's a dramatic change.
Right.
And a lot of that change has been the result of immigration. In 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965 opened the doors to countries like Africa, Asia, India, South America, Central America. And as a consequence, there has been a growth of communities of color that weren't previously as well represented here.
Yeah, well, what Steve says is that we are actually already the majority, people of color are the majority in the country already. We don't have to wait until 2040 or 2044 in that, sort of way out there kind of timeline, that it's already happened.
Well, certainly, when he's writing, he's talking about the voting population.
Yes.
And if all the people of color who are eligible to vote did vote, they would represent a majority of voters.
Yeah, I think the astonishing thing is he says in the book, and you extrapolate it so beautifully, that every single day in the United States, 8,000 people are born. Is that?
Yes.
And 90% of those are people of color.
Yes.
And so that's this rapid change that we're undergoing.
It is a rapid change, and so when we look at the political climate, one of the things that we see is that there's a lot of talk about immigration. And is that talk about immigration really a response on the part of some feeling perhaps threatened by the changing demographic?
They're closing those doors pretty fast.
Yes.
So talk to us about Black Lives Matter and how specifically that might be one of the hugest impactful things that happened during these last 20 years.
Absolutely. Well, if you think about the fact of Trayvon Martin's murder in 2012, followed in what seems like rapid succession by a number of high-profile police shootings, made high-profile because we now have technology, widespread cell phones that can take video, and we can transmit via social media images of these things happening in ways that mobilize people. It was following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case that led the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement to use that hashtag Black Lives Matter. Our lives matter was what they were saying, and that turned into a very powerful and important social movement, particularly among young people, to make visible the ways in which Black people were being killed and in other ways harmed by the police.
And in many ways, these are the kids in the cafeteria that you're talking about that are engaged in these actions.
They are engaged in these actions. Not all the kids in the cafeteria sitting together are engaged in these actions, but they certainly represent that generation. And they represent a generation of young people who are concerned about the fact that here we are in 2018, and still we are dealing with these issues. Why is that? These are young people, if you think about it, who were born in the late 90s, who were coming of age, 11, 12, when Barack Obama was elected the first time in 2008, and have grown up during those critical adolescent years, hearing people talk about a, quote, post-racial society. You know?
Well, so much for that, right?
Well, exactly, so much for that.
Right.
But they have grown up with seeing, you know, a Black man in the White House, the most powerful person in the world, you know, presumably, and yet still they're being shot in the streets.
Right. And also you point to all of the laws that had been put in place after the 1950s and 60s that now have been rescinded. That and I thought about you when Eric Holder was talking about gerrymandering just recently, and how he and Barack Obama are going to try to fix that, and they've targeted certain states that they're moving into, and on a very local level too, not just at the top.
Yes.
So you know, that retraction of rights. And not only that, but the retraction of affirmative action in colleges, where, you know, the percentage of Black students is just
all of
plummeted
those things
as well.
Are part of this backward movement that we see. But in particular, voter suppression is very concerning. The reason that Barack Obama was able to win in 2008 had to do with a very strong coalition of progressive white voters and also voters of color. That's the coalition that Steve Phillips was writing about. And that when progressive whites and people of color vote in the same direction, they accomplish a lot. And in the case of Barack Obama, it was his election as president. And yet, since that time, there has been a concerted effort that is documentable across many states, trying to make it harder for communities of color to vote. In my own state of Georgia, where I live now, we have ID laws. You have to have an ID, but the places where you can get an ID are few and far between.
Right.
And they don't exist in many communities of color.
Right, right. So that's deliberate. And I think the Supreme Court and some higher courts are beginning to make mostly the GOP repair its work in that gerrymandering.
Yes.
I also want to talk about your time at Spelman, because it's so important that if we talk about kids in the cafeteria.
Yes.
I mean, here you're talking about kids in the entire university and the entire college who are together.
Yes.
You know, in schools of color.
Yes.
And there are those who would debate that, whether or not that's a good thing. But of course, I know young women who have been through Spelman, probably when you were there too, running the school, who would say it was the best experience they ever had in their lives.
Absolutely. And when I was president, I used to regularly say to young women who would come to visit and to their parents, there are a lot of good places to go to school. There are lots of places that will offer a fine education. But there are very few places, perhaps only this place, where you can say, this place was built for me. And I'm going to be at the center of the educational experience, not on the margins of it in any way, not marginalized by my gender, not marginalized by my race, not marginalized in any way. And for that reason, anything I want to do, I'm going to have that opportunity made available to me. And I'm going to see people who look like me engaged in those things, which is a source of inspiration and confidence. And while it's certainly true that we want our students to be able to engage with people different from themselves, across lines of difference, sometimes people assume that HBCUs are homogeneous, but we know that there's a lot of diversity even within the African American community. Not everyone's coming from the same kind of neighborhood, not everyone coming from the same ethnic background, not everyone's coming from the same socioeconomic status, etc. So there's diversity within the community. But even if you're thinking about cross-racial experience, we know that if you come into those interactions with confidence, you will feel more success than if you are feeling less than.
I know people who are connected to some of the black colleges, and
Yes.
what they're talking about these days are the financial stress that they are under, and
Yes.
that the question is whether or not a full-fledged education is possible under those circumstances. Not at Spelman. You raised, what was it,
$158 million. And it was, and we worked hard to do that, but it was very exciting that people were willing to make those investments.
Yeah, and when you say people, who were those generally, those people who were saying Spelman is worth my donation, my dollars, even though there are only black girls, black young women who were in school?
Well, one of the things that's really was wonderful for me in my role as president there was to be able to say to anyone, sometimes white men, sometimes white women, certainly leaders in the African American community, but to say, this is a strong investment. This is an important investment. That if you are looking for talent, it's right here. But there's nothing worse than having a young person start their education and not be able to finish it. Financial aid is the most critical need for HBCUs, I would say, because a lot of young people come to the institution because they want what we offer, and yet the institutions are not able to provide all the financial aid that is typically needed. The typical family, the median income in African American families in the United States today is about $40,000 a year. It is very difficult to send a child to any school if your family income is only $40,000 a year. And so if you've got students who are coming from all parts of the community, all socioeconomic levels, you need a lot of financial aid to provide that support. And that's the place I find that HBCUs are most in need.
You talk in your book a lot about the Great Recession, we call it 2008, 2009, and how we really still don't recognize the devastation that the black community took during that time. Still has not recovered. If you're talking about $40,000, dollars, the average income, so tell. They were victim of, finally they thought they could afford houses, and they went to Countrywide and got ripped off. So
it's really tragic if we look at the way in which the housing market played a role in 2008 in the collapse of the economy, because historically black families, credit-worthy black families, have had difficulty getting credit, getting loans for mortgages to be able to buy houses. That goes back to the days of after World War II. We can look at
Levittown, right?
Exactly.
Those big expansive houses that were only available to whites.
Exactly. So we look at, the ways in which racial covenants kept people out of neighborhoods, limited access to loans, etc. Fast forward to the 2000s, and people are now being targeted for these risky, high-interest loans. Even families whose income and creditworthiness was equivalent to white families being offered less desirable lending products that put them at risk for these big balloon payments or other things that made the loan more risky. The economy collapses. A lot of people found themselves underwater or unable to pay for, because they lost a job maybe, pay for that big payment at the end of that loan process. And foreclosures were dramatic in the African American community, the Latinx community as well. And if you think about how many families pay for their children's education,
Precisely.
It's often, you know, taking a second mortgage on the house to help pay for the tuition. If there's no house, there's no, you know, nothing to borrow against.
So Dr. Tatum, you say in the end of your book, after frightening us, after we read all of this, all the terrible things that have happened, you say you're optimistic. A brief word about that, because then I want you to do our final statement about the power, the strength of Black America. But you say you're optimistic.
Well, I am optimistic in this sense. Certainly, we live in a difficult moment. Politically, economically, there are lots of things that are challenging for our communities. But I am optimistic because I know about the resilience of our communities, and I know that there are, if you look locally, you know, I like to say, think globally, act locally. If you look locally at what's happening in communities, I live in Atlanta, for example, there are some really great things happening in the revitalization of neighborhoods where philanthropists are working across lines of racial difference to really improve affordable housing, to invest in schools like Spelman and Morehouse College and the other AUC schools, to think about how we can really make a difference. And in terms of race relations, I'm optimistic when I see examples like the Atlanta Friendship Initiative, which was started by a white man who said, I need to connect with Black people and encourage others to do that, and started an initiative that is spreading across the city and to other cities as well. Well,
I'm glad you're giving us that kernel of hope there. And so resilience, the power, the strength of Black America, you would find it in our resilience?
I would find it in our resilience and in our understanding of our own capacity for greatness. I think if we know our history, we know that it is a tradition of excellence. And when we think about children, making sure that our children know that history of excellence so that they will have something to aspire to.
Well, thank you so much for being here. If we could just use you and say, here's Dr. Tatum. She's going to tell you all about race relations and our terrible history and hopefully our great future. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
I hope you'll come back. We have much more to talk about. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, the author of Why All the Black Kids Are Sitting Together in the Cafeteria. And thanks to you out there, too, for watching us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. We'll see you the next time.